They tell you that love is eternal, that it conquers all, that it blooms in every century like a timeless rose in the garden of human experience. But the truth, the quiet, aching, unsettling truth, is that love in the Middle Ages was not the soft candlelit affair painted in courtly poems or the dreamy tapestry woven by modern romance films. It was a transaction, a gamble, a burden, sometimes a punishment, often a silence that stretched across cold stone walls where hearts were not expected to bloom but to endure. This story is about that silence and what crept within it. It is not a tale of knights rescuing princesses or noble kisses beneath moonlit towers. It is the damp, slow-burning, haunting truth of what it meant to seek love when the world did not believe you should. Hello and welcome to Boring History for Sleep. If you enjoy this kind of quiet historical unraveling, feel free to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and, if the mood strikes, write a comment about the strangest fact you've learned tonight. It helps this small corner of the internet reach others who also want to drift into the folds of forgotten centuries. Now let's begin. The year was 1287, and the fields of Champagne were dull with mist. The villages had not yet shaken off the long chill of a bitter spring, and the thatch roofs, swollen with rain and lichen, sloped like tired shoulders against the gray. Here, in a low manor outside Troyes, lived a girl of 12 who would soon be married to a man of 38. Her name was Isabeau. She had hair the color of barley before harvest and eyes that had not yet learned to hide fear. Her world was not yet shaped by love, only by duty, proximity, silence, and the soft, brittle dread that settled into young bones long before words like romance were ever spoken aloud. She had never met the man who would be her husband. His name was Geoffroy, the son of a merchant who had grown fat on the wine trade and whose wealth had bought him a knighthood he never earned with blood. He was not cruel by nature, but he had been raised with the belief that a wife was something like a plow horse, better to be strong than sweet, obedient rather than bright. He had once loved a girl with raven hair who had died of the sweating sickness, and since then, he had chosen silence as his companion. When his father arranged a match with Isabeau's family, it was done quickly, without ceremony, in a corner of the tavern beneath the gaze of men who measured futures by the size of dowries and the number of surviving teeth. Isabeau had teeth, and a uterus. That was enough. In the weeks before her wedding, Isabeau learned how to fold sheets tightly, how to boil lye soap without fainting from the fumes, how to say yes, my lord, even when her mind wanted to ask why. Her mother, Yvette, who had once dreamed of becoming a midwife before her fingers twisted from years of laundering other people's linens, taught her how to bite her tongue, how to keep secrets, and how to sleep with her eyes open. They ate boiled turnips that season, tough, wrinkled, fibrous things that refused to soften in the pot. Salted herring if they were lucky, black bread if they were not. There were days when Isabeau dreamed of honey, though she had only tasted it twice in her life, once at a baptism, once at a funeral. Honey seemed to belong to moments when things began or ended. The priest came 2 days before the wedding. He was short, with skin like old parchment and hands that trembled as he poured wine into a cracked clay cup. He asked if the girl was of age. Her father said yes. No one questioned the lie. Isabeau's dowry consisted of 2 goats, a carved spoon, and a piece of lace that her grandmother had woven during a plague winter, her eyesight fading as she pulled the threads tighter and tighter, as if trying to trap time itself in its pattern. The wedding was quiet. A few claps, some muttered Latin, a kiss that never quite touched. That night, in the straw-stuffed bed that smelled faintly of mildew and tallow smoke, Isabeau lay still as the man beside her breathed through his mouth and did not speak. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters like a tired ghost. In the morning, she was no longer Isabeau. She was Dame de la Ferme. She was a wife. She began each day by washing her husband's feet, a task considered holy, though he rarely noticed if she skipped it. Her hands grew red and cracked from the cold water. Her duties expanded quickly, tending to the small kitchen garden, cleaning the hearth, spinning thread until her knuckles ached. Love was never mentioned. Affection was something you might show to a cat. Children were expected. By her 14th birthday, she had buried 2 miscarried babes behind the dovecot. their graves marked with smooth stones. She did not cry. Her husband prayed louder at meals. The thing is, no one expected joy. That word belonged to songs, and songs belonged to people who had time. Time, for Isabeau, was the endless stretching of moments between sunrise and sunset, between milking the goat and boiling porridge, between hearing her husband's boots on the threshold and the whisper of her own breath in the dark. But something changed the winter she turned 15. A traveler came, a tinker, selling broken combs and cheap pins, with a small lute strapped to his back and eyes that glimmered with a mischief that did not belong to this land. His name was Mark, and though she never touched him, never spoke more than a greeting, never even learned his true origin, he became, without knowing it, the first person Isabeau ever dreamed about. He sang a song once, just once, outside her window, while waiting for her husband to return with coins for a copper pan. The song was about a woman with eyes like storm clouds and a heart like fire, and though Isabeau had neither, for a moment, the air around her seemed to hum with something that had no name. She never saw him again, but he stayed, and that, in a time when love was more often a wound than a wound healer, was a revolution that in the weeks after Mark vanished beyond the ridge road, taking with him the rattle of his cart and the echo of a tune that would rot itself gently into the folds of Isabeau's mind like damp in the linen chest. Something inside her shifted. Not the bold crack of rebellion, not the fire of poetry, just the quiet ache of realizing there could be more than the rhythm she had been taught to endure, a rhythm of scraped pots and scraped knees and scraped dignity. It did not feel like love, because she did not know what love was meant to feel like, only that the song, the presence, the unshaped possibility, had curled itself like smoke into a part of her chest that had once been full of silence and was now full of something else entirely. She did not speak of him. That would have been dangerous. Her husband had never struck her, but there was a gravity in his silences, a heaviness in the way his brow darkened when her mind wandered. He asked nothing of her heart, but expected her to keep it in the house, like a broom or a pot, useful only when needed, quiet otherwise. Still, something had unlatched itself. When she boiled the pottage, she caught herself humming the tune. When she stirred the ashes in the hearth, she imagined footsteps on gravel. It was not desire. It was not sin. It was simply the knowledge that there were voices that sang instead of commanded, eyes that looked and did not demand to be worshipped or feared. Outside, the land had begun to freeze again. The river at the edge of their property slowed its trickle until it stopped, thick as glass, and the sheep huddled together like old men in prayer. In winter, love died a quieter death, unnoticed beneath the urgency of surviving. The turnips shrank. The firewood grew damp. Her husband grew colder, not in cruelty, but in presence. A man half swallowed by fatigue, muttering over accounts, gnawing bread too hard for his rotting molars. Isabeau spent long days mending torn shirts with threads made from the hair of goats, her fingers raw, her eyes red from smoke and wind. There were no mirrors in the house, only the soft distortions of polished tin, and when she stared into it, she saw not a girl, not a wife, not even a woman, but something else. Something shaped by labor, by obedience, by the absence of softness. Yet behind her eyes lived that one song, like a candle that did not flicker even when the wind came down the chimney and moaned through the cracks in the stone. Then one morning, after the feast of St. Agnes, the household changed. Geoffroy's cousin, a man named Benoit, arrived with 2 donkeys and a bundle of ledgers. He was younger, less weathered, with the kind of laugh that rolled through a room like wine through the bloodstream. Not comforting, but warm enough to be mistaken for it. He was there to help with trade records, he said, but he watched Isabeau with the eyes of a man who had once known women with laughter on their lips and bare shoulders in candlelight, and though he never touched her, never said a thing out of place, his presence made her aware again of the space her body took up, the sounds her feet made on the floor, the thinness of the walls between her and her silence. He spoke to her gently, not kindly, but with intention. He asked about the beeswax polish she used on the floor, commented on the braid in her hair, told her once that her bread was better than any he'd had in Rouen. These were small things, invisible things, things that Geoffroy never noticed, because noticing was not a virtue in husbands, only management, only patience, only the rough rhythm of routine and ownership. But Benoit noticed, and though she did not trust him, did not like him, did not want him, his gaze confirmed something that had been crawling toward consciousness for months. She was visible. She was being seen. Still, her nights were lonely. Geoffroy fell asleep quickly and snored like a millstone. The room smelled of animal fat and wet wool, and her pillow was stuffed with straw that poked through the seams. She had not spoken to another woman her age in over a year. Sometimes, she imagined conversations that never happened. She invented a sister named Celeste, who lived in a convent far away and sent letters full of jokes and prayers. In the quiet moments before sleep, she would whisper replies to these letters, sometimes aloud, pretending that someone in the darkness cared enough to ask her what she was thinking. By Lent, she was pregnant again. There was no celebration, just the grim nod of acknowledgement from her husband, the tightening of his jaw, the glance toward the ledger. Children meant alliances. Children meant inheritance. Children meant God's favor. But for Isabeau, it meant months of nausea, back pain, worry, and the gnawing knowledge that she would be alone again if the child did not survive. Alone and blamed. The midwife came from 3 villages away, a stooped woman with too many fingers and a red birthmark shaped like a wheel on her cheek. She said little. She handed Isabeau a pouch of dried herbs and a warning not to eat unripe berries. She examined her belly and pronounced the child large. Isabeau asked what she should eat. The woman shrugged. Whatever you can keep down. That was the wisdom of the time. They did not speak of tenderness. They did not speak of love. But the child stirred early before the 4th month. A strong, fluttering kick that felt like a second heartbeat. For days after, Isabeau carried her body differently, not proudly, but protectively. In the quiet moments, she whispered to the swelling below her ribs, nonsense words, half-remembered rhymes from her childhood, fragments of the song Mark had sung, little offerings into the void. She began to see other couples differently. At the village market, she noticed a baker's apprentice lean too long against the cheesemonger's daughter. She saw a widow brush a lock of hair from a priest's robe. She watched old men stare after young girls with eyes full of memory, and she wondered how many lives were shaped by what was never said aloud. There was so much pretending, so many masks. Even the priests spoke of love as something divine, but never described how it felt to miss someone who had never been yours, to remember a face that was only in your mind. One night, when Geoffroy was away on business and Benoit had gone drinking in the village, Isabeau sat alone in the kitchen. The fire was low. The house creaked like old bones. And in that stillness, she spoke aloud the only true thing she had ever felt. "I don't know what love is," she said to the air, to the silence, to the baby, to no one. "But I think I've seen it once, and I don't know if I'll ever see it again." And in the dark, there was no answer, only the sound of wind through the chimney. But somehow that silence felt like understanding. Spring did not arrive gently that year. It clawed its way through the frost like something wounded, dragging mud and rot behind it, turning the roads into ribbons of sludge and spilling thawed corpses from the shallow graves along the woods. Isabeau watched it come from the threshold of her home, one hand pressed against the weight of her stomach, the other against the lintel as if bracing herself for the way the world would shift again. Not with violence, not with noise, but with the slow, almost invisible erosion of everything she still barely understood about what it meant to be married, to be alive, to be bound to a name and a roof and a silence that had no end. The river rose and spilled into the low fields, flooding the herbs she had planted last year, drowning the lavender, stripping the rosemary of its scent. Frogs returned, fat and loud, croaking through the evenings, and the sheep bleated endlessly with swollen udders, waiting to be milked. Chickens scratched in the half-thawed manure, and everywhere there was motion. Slow, muddy, heavy motion, and she moved among it like someone who had been half-carved from wood and left unfinished. Benoit had not gone back to Rouen. He lingered. He brought strange gifts now. A small comb made from horn, a boiled egg dyed red with beetroot, a handful of almonds wrapped in linen. Nothing inappropriate, nothing spoken, but the offerings came with glances, with pauses, with the sort of smile that a man gives when he wants to be remembered in a way he cannot yet name. And still, she did not want him. Not in the way that stories tell. Not in the way of hidden trysts or stolen kisses. But his presence reminded her of the choice she had never had, the lives she would never live, and in the absence of affection from the man who shared her bed, even attention could become a kind of hunger. Her husband, meanwhile, seemed not to notice. His mind was filled with coin counting and tenant disputes, with barrels of spoiled wine and a miller who had shorted him on flour. He spoke to her as one might speak to a servant whose name they barely recall, instructive, perfunctory, with no expectation of conversation, no invitation to thought. The child, now heavy and low in her womb, kicked like a trapped bird, and sometimes when he moved, she whispered to him about snow, about fire, about the color of the sky before sunrise. Things she had never told anyone, things that might vanish from the world if someone didn't pass them on. One evening, she caught Benoit watching her, not in hunger, in curiosity, as if he saw something behind her eyes that she herself had forgotten. She turned away before she could see whether it was pity or admiration. And still the days passed. She could not walk far, her ankles swelled like ripe plums, her back ached from the weight she carried, and her hands had gone soft with the swelling of blood and water, so that even lifting the iron pot from the hearth felt like moving a mountain stone. Her world shrank to the house, to the garden's edge, to the movements of a man who barely touched her now, and the flicker of another who wanted to. It was a strange purgatory. Not cruel, not kind, not even painful in the traditional sense, just a slow dissolution of self beneath the pressure of time, obligation, repetition. She no longer dreamed of Mark. Even his song had grown thin, washed out by the whimpering of animals in the dark. The screech of owls, the creak of rafters swelled with damp. But sometimes, in the early morning, just before the birds began, she thought she heard footsteps near her window, and sometimes she wished they were real. The labor began 2 weeks early. It started in the afternoon. Not with a scream, not with blood, just with a low, tugging ache in her hips, like a rope being pulled from somewhere deep and ancient. She said nothing at first, continued slicing onions, wiping her hands on her apron, nodding when Benoit asked if Geoffroy would be home before supper. But by dusk, she could no longer stand upright. She crawled into the straw bed and bit down on the edge of her blanket until her jaw ached. And when Benoit finally realized something was wrong, he ran for the midwife. The birth was slow, long, 31 hours. The midwife arrived late, drunk on mead, stinking of garlic, cursing the mud that had nearly taken her mule. She poured hot water into a basin, barked at Isabeau to breathe, tied cloth around her thighs to keep the child from slipping into the devil's arms, and muttered prayers in a dialect that sounded more pagan than Christian. Geoffroy paced in the next room, muttering about saints and legacies, hands trembling not from fear for his wife, but fear for his name. Isabeau bled. Too much. The baby came blue, gasping, coughing fluid, but alive. A girl. Geoffroy stared at the child like she was a broken promise. Benoit, standing in the doorway, said nothing. He simply looked at Isabeau with a face that held no joy, no anger, no shame, only something that almost looked like grief. The child was named Alice. Isabeau nursed her in silence, wrapped her in the same lace her grandmother had given as part of the dowry, though it was yellowed and moth-eaten. The baby's fingers were long. Her eyes were dark. Her cry was soft, like wet cloth tearing. Geoffroy did not touch the child. He did not touch Isabeau either. He began sleeping in the small room beside the cellar, claiming her groaning and bleeding made him restless. Isabeau did not argue. She did not weep. She simply watched the fire flicker on the hearth and wondered how something so small could make her feel both powerful and powerless at once. She did not think of love. She thought of milk, of warmth, of survival. But somewhere, beneath it all, deeper than language, quieter than thought, there stirred a kind of tenderness that had no name in Latin, no place in scripture, no purpose in law. Something older, darker, softer than anything she had ever been allowed to feel, the child clung to life with the quiet ferocity of something too new to understand how easily it could vanish. Her breath shallow at first, then stronger, her mouth searching blindly in the dark for warmth and milk, while Isabeau sat against the wall, legs trembling, skin pale as curdled cream, and watched this tiny creature, this half-formed being with thin veins visible beneath skin like damp parchment, and wondered how something so helpless could reshape the shape of every thought, every motion, every heartbeat. In the nights that followed, the baby would not sleep unless pressed against her chest, skin to skin, cheek to breast, as though the space between them, even the thickness of a homespun blanket, was too great a distance after the wet, bloody closeness of the womb. Isabeau did not mind. She slept in fragments, in moments between cries, in silence thickened by snow falling outside the shutters. Her body hurt. Her bones groaned beneath the pressure of repair. Her breasts were swollen and often cracked from suckling, but she did not complain. She had grown used to pain. Pain was a language she knew how to speak with dignity. Geoffroy barely acknowledged them. He came to meals when he pleased. He returned late from the vineyard, boots thick with mud, face drawn from arguments with merchants or debtors or God. The child was not what he wanted. A girl was a burden. A girl could not carry a name forward like a banner through time. A girl could not own land. A girl was a future someone else would inherit. He did not say it. He did not have to. His absence said enough. Benoit, on the other hand, began to linger even more, under the pretense of business, of course, offering to help mend a leaking corner of the roof, volunteering to take inventory of the cellar, offering advice on how to dry herbs for trade. He brought small toys carved from bone, tiny rings of wood that rattled, smooth stones shaped like eggs, and he always handed them to the baby without touching Isabeau, though his eyes did not look at the child. They looked at her, and she saw it. Not lust, not romance, longing, not for possession, but for something that could not be named, a kind of life that might have existed, somewhere, in another world where marriages were not contracts, where hands reached for one another out of need instead of duty, where a name whispered in the dark meant comfort and not command. She did not encourage him, but she did not stop him. She allowed the offerings. She accepted the presents. Because sometimes, when the baby cried and her arms ached and the firewood ran low and the bread burned and her husband's silence loomed like a stone over her chest, it was enough simply to be seen, not as a vessel, not as a servant, not as a shadow at the edge of another man's legacy, but as a person who might still carry a voice. Alice grew fast. By the third month, she grasped fingers and laughed, though her laugh was more like a squeak, a hiccup of joy that startled even Isabeau the first time it came. She rolled in her sleep. She began to teeth. Her gums were red and swollen, and she cried often through the night, gnawing on anything her small fists could bring to her mouth. A strip of cloth, a soft stick, the corner of Isabeau's shawl. And Isabeau, though weary, though her back ached and her eyes stung, could not help but smile at this noisy, needy creature who had come from her like a secret torn into the world. The village midwife visited once, only to say the child would live and had strong lungs. She left a small pouch of dried mint and a half-chewed candle, muttering something about saints and colic. Isabeau offered her a crust of bread. The woman took it without thanks. Days passed, weeks blurred. And then, one evening, when the moon was fat and yellow like butter melting over porridge, and the child was finally asleep after hours of fussing, Isabeau went outside. She wrapped herself in a wool cloak, stepped through the kitchen door, and walked barefoot across the cold stones, needing to feel something raw, something real. The night was thick with the scent of damp moss and manure, but the sky was clear, and she tilted her head back and watched it, that vast cold canvas of stars that had seen thousands of women just like her live and die beneath it without ever asking why. She did not notice that Benoit had followed. He stood a few steps behind her, saying nothing, arms crossed, the sound of his boots crunching on gravel the only sign of his presence. When she turned, he did not move. He only looked at her with a softness that was unfamiliar in this world of hard things, and for a long moment, they simply stood there, not touching, not speaking, not even breathing too loudly, as though the air itself might shatter if stirred too roughly. "You shouldn't be out here," he said finally, not scolding, not demanding, only stating a fact. "I know," she answered. The silence between them was long and strange and almost gentle. Then she turned and went back inside. He did not follow, and nothing happened, but something had begun. Not an affair, not a plan, just a shift, a crack in the ice, a loosened thread in the tight weave of survival. She went back to her child, picked her up, held her close and whispered something. Not in prayer, not in fear, just in memory. She did not think of Geoffroy. She did not think of Mark. She did not even think of Benoit. She thought of herself, the girl she had been, the woman she was becoming, the mother, the ghost, the fire that refused to go out even when the wind howled against the shutters with the voice of every woman who had ever been forgotten. By midsummer, the bees had returned to the far end of the orchard where the flowering herbs grew thick among the nettles and wild thyme, and their buzzing filled the air like a hymn too old to trace, too constant to ignore. And Isabeau, standing beneath the drooping branches of a pear tree gone mostly barren that year, felt for the first time in months that the world could be something more than walls and firewood and silence. It could be movement, breath, wings brushing past skin with no intent but to pass, no obligation but to exist. Alice had begun to crawl. At first like a clumsy insect, arms flailing and head bobbing, her legs pushing without coordination. But within a week, she had found her rhythm, her direction, her strange purpose, chasing after the light that pooled through the wooden slats of the shutters in the afternoon, crawling toward the warmth as if her bones remembered something ancient, something older than language, something no one had taught but every child seemed to know, that light meant safety, that brightness might be something like love. Isabeau followed her like a shadow. She stayed close, always near, always watching. Even when her limbs begged for rest and her back screamed from lifting and bending and rocking and swaying. And though her world had once been a circle drawn by duty, now it had become the shape of her daughter's hands, her cries, the delicate curve of her ear as she slept against Isabeau's shoulder, breathing in short, trusting bursts that made her feel both protector and prisoner. Geoffroy had grown quieter. It was not the silence of a man too tired to speak, nor the cold of a man withdrawn by grief or illness. It was the silence of a man who believed his part was done, who had planted seed, built walls, provided meat and fire, and now returned to the role of distant observer, judge, name-giver, and owner. He did not ask how Alice was growing. He did not notice the small tooth that had broken through her pink gums. He did not remark on her first step, an unsteady stumble from hearth to table, arms wide like a bird testing wings. He nodded when told but offered nothing. He slept early, rose late, ate without looking up. Benoit stayed. He helped harvest the early apples, cursing at the worms that had turned most of them to mush. He fixed the broken hinge on the barn door. He carried buckets from the well without being asked. And still he never touched her. Not even a brush of the hand when passing bread across the table. Not even a fingertip to wrist when handing her the baby's linen wrap. But the air between them was thickening, like milk left too long by the fire. Not spoiled yet, not ruined, but changed, alive with something unspoken and dangerous and soft. Isabeau did not know what to call it. She had no words for feelings that had never been named in her household, no language for the way her thoughts drifted toward the shape of Benoit's hands as he split wood, for the way her breath caught when he sang to himself. Not the song of Mark, not that wild wind melody, but simple, rough tunes hummed through his teeth, earthy and unpolished, but real. It was not desire. It was not love. It was recognition. That someone else moved through the same dull days, saw the same cracked walls, heard the same night sounds and did not turn to dust beneath them. That someone else was awake. And then, without warning, the plague arrived. Not the great Black Death, not the cataclysm of a future century, but the local plague, the village rot, the sudden fever that swept through the valley like a whispered curse, turning faces gray and bellies to stone, stealing breath in hours, leaving behind stiff limbs and the stench of thyme and vinegar. It began with a child, not Alice, another, the baker's boy, 6 years old, found dead in the straw before morning, then 2 more by sunset, then the cheesemonger's wife, then the priest's nephew, and suddenly no one left their homes. Doors were shuttered. Smoke rose without interruption. Church bells rang not for service but for burial. The road to Troyes was barricaded with dead animals and sacks of hay soaked in pitch. No one spoke in the square. No one touched. Geoffroy returned from the vineyard with his hands wrapped in linen. His eyes sunken, his voice dry. He claimed it was nothing. Too much sun, bad wine. But he coughed that night, and the sound was wet. Isabeau boiled everything. Water, milk, rags, her own hands. She hung herbs in every corner, wormwood, rue, rosemary, and burned them until the house reeked of smoke and bitterness. She placed garlic under Alice's crib, tucked nettle leaves into the seams of the door. She slept on the floor beside the baby, listening for each breath, waiting for silence. Geoffroy's fever rose. He began muttering about land, about debts, about women he had never mentioned before. He did not look at her. He soiled the bed. He vomited blood. And still she cared for him, not out of love, not out of duty, but because there was no one else, and because to turn away would be to become something she was not ready to be. He died on the third night, quietly. First she thought he was sleeping. Then she noticed the stillness, the way his chest no longer rose, the strange slackness of his jaw. She did not scream. She did not cry. She closed his eyes with 2 fingers, lit a candle, and whispered a prayer she did not believe in. She did not wake the child. She did not wake Benoit. She waited for morning. The burial was quick. For men from the village came with linen, with lime, with shovels. They said little. They did not ask how he died. They knew. They buried him near the orchard, behind the row of elder trees, far from the house, and marked the grave with a stone that had once been part of a wall long fallen. Benoit stood beside her, silent. After they left, she nursed Alice in the doorway, watching the flies gather around the edge of the woodpile, and she thought not of death, but of how quiet the house had become. Not in grief, but in possibility. For the first time since her wedding, she was not owned, not claimed, not watched. She did not smile. She did not mourn. She waited. She breathed. And in that breath, something ancient stirred. Not joy, not freedom, not love, but the slow realization that the world had shifted beneath her feet, and she was still standing. The days after the burial stretched like old linen hung to dry in a windless field, stiff, slow, suspended. And Isabeau, now a widow not by age but by the strange mercy of a fever, moved through the house not as a ghost, not as a survivor, but as something new, something unshaped, something caught between the stillness of morning and the rustling breath of an unfamiliar freedom that did not come with trumpets or weeping but with the quiet sound of floorboards that no longer creaked beneath another man's boots. No one spoke of love. No one came to offer condolences. In the countryside, death was expected, and mourning was a luxury afforded only by those who had the time to dress it in ritual. But the firewood still needed chopping, the goats still bleated, the milk still soured if left too long, and Alice still cried for warmth and food and the sound of her mother's voice in the dark. Grief, in the fields, did not wear black. It wore calluses and cold hands in silence. Benoit remained, not with announcement or presumption, but with the same slow presence he had always kept, appearing when needed, vanishing when not, filling the empty hours with the weight of routine, the patching of the roof, the tending of the vines, the checking of traps and gates and latches. He did not speak of Geoffroy. He did not speak of the child. He did not even speak of the future. But something in the way he moved, slower, more deliberate, told her that he felt the shift too. And though he still never touched her, there was something different in the way he stood now. Not closer, not bolder, but less apart, as though the space between them was no longer defined by what could not be but by what might, one day, quietly, without permission, come to be. The baby grew. By the time the leaves began to yellow and fall, Alice had begun to stand. Wobbly, determined, her legs, soft and fat, trembled under the weight of her own delight, and she clung to the edge of chairs, to her mother's skirt, to the rough wall of the kitchen, babbling nonsense that carried through the house like birdsong in the hour just before dawn. Isabeau would stop mid-task sometimes, holding a bundle of drying herbs or a bowl of milky water, and just listen, not because the sound was beautiful, though it was, but because it was proof that something was alive, truly alive, and not merely enduring. She had not smiled this much in years. Not since she was a child herself, hidden under the table during storms, watching the legs of grown men argue about taxes and pigs and borderlines, and imagining that the world was made of nothing but shoes and crumbs and words she wasn't supposed to hear. And now, here she was, in her own kitchen, barefoot, bone-tired, wrapped in a shawl that still smelled faintly of ash and goat hair, listening to her daughter laugh at shadows. There were moments, brief, almost cruel in their suddenness, when she caught herself wishing she could write. Not Latin, not the stiff, church-bound language of God and law, but her own words, her own script, just to carve this moment somewhere that it couldn't be stolen. The sound of her child's breath, the weight of her own name whispered into stillness with no one to answer it back in command. But she could not. She had never been taught. And so she held the memory not in ink but in silence, stitching it into her body like a second skin. The village had quieted after the plague. Some doors remained closed. Some roofs never got repaired. The bell stopped ringing. The priest was replaced by a younger man, wide-eyed and frightened, who flinched at loud noises and spent most of his sermons talking about obedience rather than grace. There were whispers about a healer who had vanished, a boy who had been burned with the straw he slept in, a goat found painted red in the woods. No one said the word witch. They never did. But they knew. Isabeau did not care. She kept to her land. She lit her fire. She boiled her water. And each day, as the sun rose over the frost-stiffened grass, she pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead and whispered a single word. Enough. Not, I love you. Not, you are mine. Just enough. Because that, in a world built on hunger, hunger for food, for warmth, for recognition, for power, for safety, for touch, was the only blessing she had the right to give. By the time the first snow came, the house had changed. Not in shape, but in atmosphere. The shadows no longer lingered. The silences no longer felt like traps. Benoit had moved into the barn, saying nothing of permanence, building a small sleeping space beneath the hayloft, where he kept to himself and brought in firewood without being asked, mended buckets, repaired shutters, even carved a new spoon from applewood for Alice, though the child preferred to chew on the legs of chairs. He never entered without knocking. He never stayed past sundown. But once, on a day when the wind howled and the windows trembled in their frames, he stood at the door with a bowl of salted turnip stew, handed it to her and said only, "No one should eat cold in winter." It was not affection. It was not love, but it was kindness. And that, in the ruins of all that had come before, was something sacred. That night, Isabeau sat by the fire, Alice asleep beside her, the bowl empty, her hands wrapped around the last of the warmth in the pottery, and she listened, not to voices, not to music, not to memory, but to the breathing of the child, the creak of the wind in the beams, the slow settling of the house around her, and for the first time in years, she did not feel watched. She did not feel claimed. She did not feel afraid. She simply existed, and in that existence, there was something stronger than love. There was space. The winter deepened not with storm but with stillness, a kind of cold that did not bite, but pressed, not with fangs, but with weight, a pressure that settled into the beams of the house, into the seams of garments, into the joints of bones long used to strain and repetition. And inside that frozen hush, where the world turned gray beneath layers of hoarfrost and unmoving sky, Isabeau began to understand something that she had never been told, something that no priest or mother or elder had thought to say aloud. That survival was not merely the absence of death, that to live was not the same as to endure. Each morning she woke not to bells or roosters or men shouting about barrels, but to the slow stirrings of her daughter, now more girl than infant, her arms flung wide in sleep, her small mouth open in dreams too young to carry fear, and sometimes, in those first moments before her own feet touched the cold floor, Isabeau would watch the child breathe and feel a tightness in her throat. Not sorrow, not joy, not even hope, but something thinner, sharper, something like a mixed with dread, because Alice was becoming, unfolding, absorbing, and everything that passed through the child's eyes, every word, every silence, every gesture, would shape her into someone who might one day ask questions that her mother had never dared to voice. Outside, the land had stopped moving. Snow lay over the vineyard like unbaked dough, thick and uneven, hiding the damage of autumn rot, the tools forgotten in haste, the footprints that led away from the barn and never returned. The stream froze not clean but crooked, with strange bends of ice that cracked in the dark. Foxes wandered near the henhouse. Wolves, it was said, had come down from the hills. Fires burned longer, bread grew harder, milk clotted too fast, and the nights became so silent that even the creak of the cradle felt like a scream. She had not spoken to another woman in months. The village remained distant, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. A widow, especially a young one, especially one who did not remarry immediately, especially one who kept company with a man not her kin, was something uncertain, something that made people glance too long or too little, whisper when backs were turned, offer smiles without warmth. They did not accuse. They did not scorn. They simply observed, and in such observation, there was a kind of exile that no church could name and no hearth could soften. Benoit remained, still in the barn, still quiet, still helpful, but even the way he moved began to change, slowly, like water adjusting to the shape of a new vessel. Less deferent, more settled, as if the rhythm of the house had begun to pull him into its own strange tide. He repaired the wheelbarrow. He stacked wood not in piles but in patterns that let the wind pass through. He began carving again. Not tools, not spoons, but shapes with no purpose, little animals, flowers, twisted loops that served only to pass time. And sometimes he left them near the hearth where Alice could find them, and the child, with her growing hands and her babbling mouth, would hold them aloft like treasures stolen from some hidden kingdom. He never gave them directly. He never entered uninvited. But the things he made began to live in the house, like footprints in snow that did not melt. One evening, when the fire burned low and the stew had simmered down to thick silence, Isabeau asked him why he carved. He looked up from his seat near the door, took a long moment to answer, and then said, "So I don't forget how to shape things that don't bleed." She did not reply. There was nothing to say. But the words stayed with her, echoing days later when she watched Alice try to stack those little shapes, when she knelt on the floor beside her and traced the curve of a wooden bird with her thumb, and felt how smooth it had become beneath the hands of a man who did not demand, did not explain, did not assume, only made. There were nights when Isabeau lay awake long after the child slept, her fingers curled under her own chin, her mind adrift in the slow smoke of thought, and she wondered, not aloud, not even fully formed, what would happen if she asked him to stay, not as helper, not as cousin, not as man to barn and firewood, but as something else, something without a name yet, without rules, something not defined by church or coin or the mouths of others, something built like the carvings, small, patient, unfinished, shaped only by time and attention. But she did not ask, because she was afraid, not of scandal, not of damnation, not even of loss, but of desire, because desire had never been hers before, had always been something given or taken, permitted or punished, and the thought of claiming it, of reaching toward it not in secrecy but in daylight, felt as strange as holding a mirror for the first time and seeing not what others saw but what had been hidden under years of dust and obedience. And still the silence grew warm. The house did not feel empty. The days passed not as burdens but as rhythm. They boiled root vegetables. They stitched together bits of linen for Alice's growing frame. They hung dry herbs from the rafters. They made small repairs. They read no scriptures. They spoke of no future. But in the motion, in the breath, in the absence of demand, something whole began to settle around them, not as fate, not as plan, but as texture, the texture of a life not chosen, but grown. And then, one night, while the wind screamed like something being born outside the shuttered windows, and the child had finally fallen into sleep after hours of restlessness, Isabeau stood near the fire, her hands red from scrubbing, her feet swollen in the cold, and she turned toward the barn door, half expecting the shape of Benoit to be there, waiting as he sometimes did with a lantern or news of a fallen fence. But he wasn't. He did not come that night, nor the next, and on the third day she went to the barn. It was empty. His tools were gone. His bed was stripped. No carvings remained. No notes. No marks. No firewood waiting near the door. Only the scent of old hay and the cold echo of footsteps no longer retracing themselves. She did not weep. She fed the child. She mended a tear in her sleeve. She stirred the ashes. And when night came again, she sat beside the fire and said nothing, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the shadows that danced along the wall, because she understood now. Love, in this world, did not always announce itself with poetry or kisses or confessions. Sometimes it was a carved bird left beside a cradle, sometimes a bowl of hot food, sometimes the choice not to stay when staying would mean becoming something he wasn't ready to be. And though the fire would burn down and the wind would rise again, though the child would grow and ask, though the years would stretch and fade, Isabeau would always remember the sound the barn made when it was empty. Not because it broke her heart, but because it didn't. It left space, and in that space, something stronger than longing could begin. The barn remained empty through the rest of the winter, its silence more complete than even the frost-stilled woods beyond the stream, more deliberate than the hush of the road where no one passed anymore unless carrying either a sack of flour or a wrapped body. And Isabeau, though she never spoke his name, though she never stepped again across the threshold of that building with its hollow warmth and memory-laden straw, could not stop feeling as though something just beyond language had shifted inside her. Not snapped, not fallen, but bent, reshaped quietly in the long, still hours between dusk and sleep. The routine resumed, because it had to, because nothing in the house would move unless she moved it, because Alice needed clean linen and boiled water and spoonfuls of mashed root that did not come from grief or longing but from labor, and because in a world where nothing was promised, not peace, not return, not even the passing of the frost, there was a kind of safety in doing what had always been done, in rising when the light returned, in washing the same bowl again and again until even the ache in the fingers became a kind of rhythm. Alice began to speak. Not words, not yet, but sounds shaped with purpose, gestures that mimicked commands she had seen, small imitations of her mother's movements. Stirring an invisible pot with a splintered stick, patting the side of the hearth where no fire burned, lifting her arms to the empty doorway where once someone had stood with a carved wooden bird and the scent of pine on his coat. She remembered. The child remembered. And in her remembering, Isabeau found herself caught between comfort and unease, because there was something both beautiful and terrible about seeing traces of someone in the behavior of someone else, someone who could not yet speak the name of absence but carried its weight in the way her fingers paused mid-motion, in the way her eyes searched the corners of the room when dusk came too early. No one came asking for him. No letters arrived. No travelers passed with word of a man who once carved spoons to keep his hands from turning to violence. And yet, the absence was not hollow. It was thick. It filled the room like steam from boiling water. Not seen, but felt on the skin, in the lungs, in the quiet tension of breath held too long. She did not try to explain. Not to the child, not to herself, not even in prayer. But when she walked the edge of the vineyard with Alice bundled against her chest, wrapped in wool and warmed by the rhythm of her mother's heartbeat, she found herself looking at the path that led over the hill, the one they never used, the one that curved toward the forest and disappeared into moss and root and fallen stone, and she wondered, though she would never admit it aloud, whether it was the way he had gone. Snow fell again in early spring, not heavy, just enough to remind them that the earth was not finished sleeping. The trees, eager to bloom, shivered in their bare bones, and the goats bleated without reason, sensing the confusion in the soil. And Isabeau, though exhausted by the dragging rhythm of winter's false retreat, welcomed the delay, because she was not ready yet for what would come with thaw, for the men who would return to the fields, for the gossip that would sprout with the first herbs, for the way that sunlight would find the dust in her windows and reveal how little she had cleaned, how little she had prepared for a world that moved forward without asking whether you wished to go with it. At night, she sat by the fire and spun. Wool mostly, sometimes flax. The wheel had belonged to her mother-in-law, and though the wood was cracked in places and the foot tread groaned like something alive, the motion was steady, and the thread grew beneath her fingers like time itself. Thin, fragile, continuous, always one pull away from ruin but still moving forward, always forward. Alice played at her feet, quiet now, self-contained, content with buttons and rags and a chipped wooden bowl. And Isabeau, watching her from beneath lashes heavy with ashen thought, found herself wondering not for the first time what kind of woman this child might become, whether she would learn to read, whether she would marry a man with a name or one with warm hands, whether she would grow old in this house or vanish down some road without warning. The thought did not scare her. It made her ache, because no one had ever wondered those things about her. Not with tenderness, not with curiosity, not with care. And the idea that her daughter might one day be more than what the world expected, might one day carry herself not as a shadow, not as a tool, but as a person with her own weight, her own shape, her own desires, that idea made her feel both older and younger than she had ever been. Spring did come eventually, late, muddy, heavy with rot and noise and small birds that nested in the eaves with the reckless confidence of creatures who had never known disappointment. And with the thaw came the letters. Not many, only 2. One addressed to the steward, written in tight, slanted script with broken Latin and careless ink. The other with no name on the outside, folded carefully and placed inside a leather pouch left at the edge of the well. She found it one morning while drawing water, her hands still stiff from sleep, her thoughts still wrapped in the rhythm of the wheel, and for a long time she did not open it, did not even touch it, just stared at the shape of it, the careful fold, the weight of words not yet read. When she did open it, alone, after Alice had slept, after the fire had died, after the shutters had been fastened tight, she found no confession, no apology, no poetry. Only this: some things cannot grow where they are planted. Some things must take root where they fall. If you keep spinning, I will know you are still there. No name, no promise, no request, just that. A phrase folded like a memory. And for the first time in weeks, she did not think of loss. She thought of thread. She thought of wool. She thought of spinning. And the next morning, before the sun broke fully over the tree line, she sat at the wheel again, placed her bare foot against the pedal, pressed her palm against the cool spindle, and began. Not because she had to, not because the house required it, not even because the market would need linen come June, but because someone somewhere was listening not with ears but with hands. And in that silent exchange, a wheel turning in one place, a man walking in another, there was a kind of love the world had no word for. Not romantic, not sacred, not written, but real. The days grew longer not as a blessing but as a slow reveal, as if the light itself, by stretching further across the wooden floorboards and lingering too long on the soot-streaked windows, exposed the quiet erosion of solitude into something more brittle than loneliness, something that could not be named without breaking it. And as the frost withdrew from the corners of the fields and the goats grew restless with milk and heat, Isabeau found herself moving differently through the house. Not faster, not louder, but with the strange attentiveness of someone who had realized she was being watched not by others, not by God, not even by memory, but by her own expectations, by the shadow of who she thought she might become if no one else ever arrived again. The letter remained tucked inside a clay jar behind the firewood stack, never reread but never forgotten, its presence so steady, so exact, so perfectly restrained, that it began to behave less like a message and more like a ritual, something she could feel pressing against the inside of the wall as she passed, something that hummed when the house fell silent, something not quite there and yet never absent. She did not tell anyone. She did not answer. She spun wool. She combed the hair from her daughter's eyes. She planted the early vegetables with soil still clinging to her knuckles long after dusk, her sleeves damp and her back sore, and in the rhythm of this return to motion, this seasonal awakening not just of the land but of the body's routines, she began to notice how different everything felt without command, how strange it was to belong only to the space she moved through, how unfamiliar it was to breathe without asking permission to inhale. Alice had grown taller. Not by much, but enough that she no longer fit beneath the cradle's arch, enough that she began to follow her mother not only with her eyes but with her feet, her steps uneven and brave, her hands always reaching toward the thing she was not yet allowed to touch, the kettle, the spindle, the shears, the flame. And though Isabeau had always sworn she would never be harsh, never raise her voice the way voices had once broken over her like weather, there were days when exhaustion made her sharper than she meant, when her words struck too quickly, when her patience unraveled faster than the thread she twisted with aching fingers. On those nights, after the child had cried and then slept, curled into the crook of her own arm with the kind of trust that undoes all certainty, Isabeau sat beside the fire and stared not at the embers but at her own hands, chapped, calloused, veined like riverbanks, and wondered how much damage they could still do even after learning how to cradle life. The neighbors had begun to return, not with joy, not with kindness, but with eyes. The baker's wife passed her at the well and offered a nod that landed like a stone. Too heavy, too late. The smith's boy, now tall and thin and full of questions he had not yet learned to silence, asked her whether the barn was still empty, whether the man who fixed hinges would come back when the roads dried. She did not answer. She offered him a piece of cheese wrapped in linen and turned away, not out of anger, but because she had no words for what had become of her life. Not shame, not secrecy, not even sorrow, just a kind of sacred privacy she would not give up simply to satisfy the mouths of people who still measured virtue by silence and obedience. In the evenings, when the shadows stretched long and the birds moved in low bursts over the hedgerows, she would sometimes walk the orchard again, this time with Alice on her hip or tugging at her skirts, this time not as a widow or a mother or even as a woman with a history, but as something simpler, a body in motion, a pair of eyes watching the trees bud again, a heartbeat sinking to the rhythm of distant hooves or nearby wind. She did not look toward the hill, not anymore, or perhaps she looked too often, but only with her breath, never with her eyes, never with her feet. And though the barn remained empty and the letter stayed unread and the sky continued to turn above her like it always had, indifferent, vast, endlessly blue, there was a kind of comfort in the unfinishedness of it all, in the fact that no chapter had closed, that no promise had hardened into fact, that she could still live in the space between a question and an answer without crumbling. Sometimes, at night, she would dream of other women. Not faces she knew, not voices she recognized, but presences. Women threading needles beside rivers, women grinding grain with slow, muscular patience, women giving birth in silence or washing their dead or standing with their backs to open doors they never closed. And she would wake not afraid, not sad, but full, as if some invisible lineage had pressed its palm to her spine and reminded her that she was not the first to live like this, that she was not alone, even when no one else remained. That to remain, to keep feeding, to keep spinning, to keep noticing, was itself a form of defiance. She did not light candles for the past. She did not speak of love. She did not wait for return. But the wheel turned, the child grew, the goats bleated, the wind changed, and in the hushed choreography of those small daily repetitions, the heat of a spoon stirred into soup, the soft clatter of a wooden toy dropped on the floor, the sigh of a body that has survived another day without forgetting its own name. There bloomed, slowly, impossibly, something fragile and powerful and undeserved, something like peace. The arrival of spring brought not only the softening of frozen earth, but also an awakening within the walls of the small house where Isabeau lived with Alice. A kind of slow flowering that was less visible than the buds swelling on the orchard trees and more felt in the shifting shadows across the worn wooden floor, in the gentle tilt of her daughter's head as she reached for the first ripe strawberry of the season, in the soft, almost imperceptible loosening of the tension that had wrapped itself around Isabeau's shoulders like a cloak too heavy to shed but too itchy to ignore. And though the days lengthened and the sun grew bolder, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air above the hearth where a fire still burned every evening to chase away the lingering chill, the true warmth came not from the flames but from the subtle pulse of life reclaiming its place in the quiet corners of the home. A life woven from the threads of routine, of whispered promises not spoken aloud, and of the small acts that hold worlds together even when hope feels fragile or distant. The village, still scarred by loss, began to breathe again, hesitantly and unevenly, like a body waking from a long fever, with neighbors offering cautious greetings that skirted the edges of sympathy and curiosity. Their eyes darting away too quickly to allow comfort to settle, and the market, once abandoned and silent, reopened with the creak of carts and the clatter of pots, the voices of sellers calling out wares that seemed both ordinary and precious, as if each loaf of bread or bundle of herbs carried the weight of survival and the possibility of renewal. Yet Isabeau remained mostly apart, tending her small garden patch, spinning thread by the fire, watching Alice as the child's laughter grew more frequent and her steps steadier. And though the world stirred beyond her walls, inside the house the passage of time felt measured not in days but in the slow weaving of existence itself, where every breath and every glance carried meaning beyond what words could capture. In these hours, the unspoken grew heavy with possibility, a presence that hovered like the scent of wet earth after rain, neither grasped nor ignored, a feeling that settled quietly between Isabeau and the empty spaces where Benoit had once moved. His absence felt as keenly as his presence had been, a hollow that shaped the edges of her days and drew her thoughts toward futures unwritten and fears unnamed. And while the letter remained folded and hidden away, its words echoed softly in her mind like a refrain from a distant song, reminding her that some things must take root where they fall, that life persists not by grand gestures but by the patient turning of the wheel, the gentle coaxing of thread through fingers worn and steady. Alice, growing stronger and more curious with each passing day, began to explore the world beyond the hearth with a determined innocence, her small hands reaching toward the bright colors of spring flowers, the rough bark of trees, the shimmering surface of puddles that caught the sky. And Isabeau, watching her child discover the world anew, felt an ache that was neither sorrow nor joy but something deeper, a recognition of the fragile and precious thread of life that connected them across time and loss, a thread woven from countless moments of care and endurance, of quiet strength and unspoken love that defied the harshness of their world and the weight of history pressing upon them both. And so, as the seasons turned and the earth warmed beneath the returning sun, Isabeau found herself not only tending to the needs of her child and home, but also nurturing the delicate, unseen life growing within herself. A life that whispered of resilience and renewal, of the possibility that even in the shadowed spaces left by absence, something new could take root and grow, fragile and beautiful. A testament to the enduring power of quiet courage and the unyielding will to simply exist, to breathe, to hold space for what might come next, even when the future remained uncertain and the past stretched long and unyielding behind her. The warmth of early summer crept through the cracked panes of the small windows like a hesitant visitor, casting patterns of light that shifted slowly as the day wore on, illuminating the dust and the worn surfaces that carried the faint scent of dried herbs and wood smoke, while outside, the orchard blossomed in a riot of white and pink petals, each one fragile and ephemeral, reminding Isabeau that life, despite its precariousness, found ways to continue its delicate dance between bloom and decay, and beneath the heavy boughs where bees hummed tirelessly, Alice wandered with an unsteady gait, chasing after shadows and laughter that belonged to the long-forgotten days before the plague, days when the village was full of voices and warmth and certainty. And though those days were gone, replaced by silence and the slow gathering of wounds, the child's presence wove a quiet thread of hope through the fabric of the household, a reminder that even in the wake of loss, life could still find its way forward, slowly, unevenly, and with the stubborn insistence of a wildflower breaking through cracked stone. Isabeau found herself returning more frequently to the garden patch she had planted in early spring, bending over the soft earth with fingers roughened and calloused from years of toil, turning soil that still held traces of frost and ash, coaxing shoots of lettuce and beans to rise toward the sky, a small rebellion against the long winters and harder days that threatened to swallow everything whole. And as she worked, the rhythms of planting and tending became a kind of meditation, a way to channel grief and exhaustion into the pulse of growth and renewal, where each leaf that unfurled was a quiet triumph, each blossom a promise whispered softly into the breeze that swept through the fields beyond, carrying with it the scent of possibility and the memory of what once was. The house itself seemed to breathe with the changing season, the wooden beams warming under the touch of sunlight that lingered longer each day, the hearthstones cool in the midday quiet, the soft rustle of linen and wool as Isabeau spun thread near the fire, her hands steady and sure despite the weight of years and loss, while Alice played at her feet with the simple joy of discovery, gathering wildflowers or chasing the errant shadows cast by fluttering curtains, unaware of the invisible threads that bound her to the past and to the uncertain future, her laughter a fragile thread woven through the quiet tapestry of their shared existence, a sound both new and ancient, echoing through the small rooms like a secret song only they could hear. Benoit's absence remained a quiet presence, a space in the rhythm of daily life that neither expanded nor contracted, a question left unasked and unanswered, hovering in the corners of Isabeau's mind like the distant rumble of thunder on the horizon, a reminder that not all losses were marked by ceremony or tears, some simply settled into the marrow of being, shaping the contours of memory and desire without ever demanding recognition. And while she did not speak of him aloud, nor seek his return, the shadow of what might have been lingered like the faint scent of pine on a breeze long past. A whisper carried through the turning seasons that reminded her of the fragile balance between holding on and letting go. As the days lengthened and the sun climbed higher, Isabeau found moments of unexpected clarity amidst the relentless demands of survival, moments when the world seemed to pause just long enough for her to catch a glimpse of something beyond the immediate, something vast and unspoken, like the shimmer of heat on the horizon or the quiet murmur of water beneath ice. And in those moments, she felt a stirring within herself, a slow, steady awakening that was neither joy nor sorrow but something deeper and more enduring, a recognition that beneath the layers of grief and hardship, beneath the weight of expectations and loss, there remained a core of resilience and quiet strength that could not be extinguished, a light that flickered not with the blaze of passion, but with the steady glow of persistence, illuminating the path forward even when the way was unclear and the journey uncertain. And so, in the soft embrace of early summer, with the earth alive beneath her hands and the child's laughter weaving through the rooms like sunlight caught in cobwebs, Isabeau continued to live not as a woman defined by loss or absence, but as one shaped by endurance and quiet hope, holding space for the unfolding story of her life and that of the small soul she nurtured, weaving threads of thread and love and memory into a tapestry that was imperfect, fragile, and real, a testament to the power of living fully even when the world offers no guarantees. And in that living, she found a kind of peace that, while never loud or triumphant, carried within it the strength to face whatever seasons might come. The ripening summer moved quietly through the countryside, its heat settling over the fields like a heavy cloak that pressed down not with violence but with a slow insistence, bending the grasses and coaxing the ripe fruit to swell on low-hanging branches. While inside the small house where Isabeau lived with Alice, the air grew thick with the scent of drying herbs and warm earth, mixing with the faint aroma of wood smoke that lingered from the hearth fire which now burned only when the evening chill crept in, a subtle reminder that though the seasons shifted, the rhythms of life remained tethered to the slow turning of sun and shadow, of planting and harvest, of sleepless nights soothed only by whispered lullabies and the steady beat of a mother's heart beneath a child's small body curled close in sleep. Isabeau's hands, once raw from the constant work of the colder months, now moved with a different kind of purpose, weaving baskets from pliant willow branches gathered by the stream, tending the flowering herbs that bloomed in wild clusters outside the door, plucking ripe currants with gentle fingers that trembled not with fatigue but with the quiet reverence of one who understands the fleeting nature of abundance and the delicate balance between life and decay. And as she worked, the sounds of the village beyond her walls reached her in fragments, the distant barking of dogs, the faint murmur of voices, carrying news and gossip that felt both distant and oddly comforting, a reminder that though her world had shrunk to the size of a hearth and garden, it still beat in rhythm with the larger story unfolding just beyond the ridge. Alice, now toddling with increasing confidence, explored the shaded corners of the orchard with a curiosity that was both innocent and fierce, her small hands reaching out to touch the rough bark of the old apple trees, the soft petals of wildflowers, the glistening surface of the pond where dragonflies skimmed like living jewels, and in her eyes shone the unspoken promise of new beginnings, the fragile hope carried on the wings of a child who had known too little of pain to be burdened by it, and too much of loss to ever take safety for granted, a living testament to the tenacity of life in the face of shadow and absence. The days unfolded in a slow, sacred pattern. The rising sun pulling light through narrow windows, the ritual of breaking bread and sharing water, the steady turning of the spinning wheel that sang a quiet song of continuity and patience, the care taken to mend torn garments and patch worn blankets, the evenings filled with the soft glow of candlelight and the low murmur of stories told not in words but in the touch of a hand or the glance shared across a table scarred by time. And in this weaving of the ordinary and the extraordinary, Isabeau found a fragile sanctuary, a place where grief softened into memory and memory into something like grace. Though Benoit's absence remained a hollow ache, a silence that settled heavily in the corners of the rooms he once moved through, Isabeau no longer felt the sharp sting of loss with every breath. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance, a recognition that some stories end not with closure but with openness, that some departures leave behind not only emptiness but the possibility of space. space to grow, to change, to find new ways of being whole in a world that offered no guarantees. And in this understanding, she discovered a strength born not of defiance but of surrender, a resilience rooted deeply in the earth beneath her feet and the blood that flowed through her veins, carrying the promise of renewal even when hope seemed as fragile as the petals falling from the orchard trees. As the sun set later each evening, casting long shadows that stretched across the fields like fingers reaching for something just beyond grasp, Isabeau would sit by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes tracing the flickering light as it danced upon the walls, and in those moments of quiet reflection, she allowed herself to imagine a future not dictated by loss or absence but shaped by the slow, steady growth of love, not the grand, sweeping kind sung of in ballads or preached from pulpits, but the small, unspoken acts that filled the spaces between breaths, the gentle touch that healed without words, the patient waiting that held space for what might yet come, a love woven from threads of time and memory, fragile yet unbreakable, a testament to the enduring power of the human heart. The heavy summer air, thick with the scent of ripening fruit and sun-baked earth, seemed to fold around the small cottage as the days lengthened into evenings glowing with the soft amber light of dusk, where shadows stretched like gentle waves against the worn stone hearth and the quiet murmur of the spinning wheel spun threads not only of wool but of time itself, weaving together moments of care and memory that flowed seamlessly between mother and child, between absence and presence, where each breath carried the weight of unspoken stories and each glance held the fragile promise of something just beyond reach, a future not yet shaped but tenderly cradled in the slow turning of seasons and the patient unfolding of lives intertwined in ways neither fully understood nor controlled. Isabeau, worn but unbowed, moved through her days with the steady grace of one who has learned to live with loss not as a wound to be healed but as a part of her very being. An ache that throbbed quietly beneath the surface yet never overwhelmed the delicate rhythms she had forged for herself and Alice, whose laughter now rang clearer and freer than before, echoing through the orchard as she chased after the flickering shadows cast by swaying branches, a living reminder that life, though battered and bruised, continued to press forward with a stubborn vitality that defied despair and whispered of renewal in even the smallest of joys. The garden, tended with relentless care despite the heat that pressed upon the earth like a weight, yielded its bounty in modest abundance, with plump tomatoes glowing like embers in the sunlight and fragrant herbs offering their healing scent to the heavy air, while bees hummed tirelessly among the blossoms, their ceaseless work a quiet testament to the persistence of life's cycle. And as Isabeau gathered the harvest with careful hands, she felt a strange kinship with these small creatures, each carrying their burden through the sweltering days with a purpose that mirrored her own. A silent devotion to the act of living despite uncertainty and the ever-present shadow of what had been lost. At night, when the sky stretched wide and dark overhead, jeweled with countless stars that seemed to pulse with ancient light, Isabeau would hold Alice close, feeling the warmth of the child's breath against her skin, the steady rise and fall of a heart beating with unspoken promises. And though the world beyond their walls remained a place of hardship and judgment, of whispered questions and sideways glances, within the fragile cocoon of their home there blossomed a quiet sanctuary, a space where love took root not in grand declarations but in the everyday acts of care, the gentle smoothing of tangled hair, the soft hum of a lullaby sung low enough to blend with the crackling fire, the weaving of blankets thick enough to hold dreams yet gentle enough to cradle hope. The memory of Benoit lingered still, a shadow etched into the corners of the house and the depths of Isabeau's thoughts, neither forgotten nor fully embraced, a presence that hovered between absence and remembrance like a faint scent carried on the wind. And while the letter remained folded away in its secret place, its words resonated through the slow unfolding of days, a reminder that some connections transcend distance and time, existing not in the spoken word but in the silent exchange of acts and gestures, in the spaces left open for possibilities that may never come to pass but nonetheless sustain the heart through its darkest hours. Life, in its quiet insistence, continued to move forward, shaped by the gentle cadence of the spinning wheel, the soft footsteps of a child learning to find her place in a world that demanded resilience and grace in equal measure, and the subtle dance of shadow and light that played across worn floorboards and weathered walls, weaving a tapestry of existence marked not by grand events but by the enduring power of presence, the strength found in small moments of tenderness, and the unspoken promise that even in the harshest seasons, life holds within it the seeds of renewal waiting patiently to be nurtured by time, by love, and by the steadfast courage to keep living when all else seems uncertain. As the summer days drifted slowly toward their end, the heat softened beneath the gentle caress of evening breezes that whispered through the orchard trees, stirring the heavy scent of ripened fruit and wildflowers that clung to the warm air like a fading memory. And within the small cottage where Isabeau and Alice lived, the light dimmed to a golden hue that pooled softly across the rough-hewn wooden table, illuminating the faded scratches and stains that marked the passing of countless meals. And moments, while outside, the cicadas sang their persistent song, weaving a background hum that mingled with the crackling fire and the soft rustle of linen as Isabeau bent over her spinning wheel, her fingers steady and sure despite the weariness that clung to her like a second skin, spinning thread not only of wool but of hope, resilience, and the quiet determination that had carried her through the harshest of winters and into this fragile season of growth. Alice, now moving with the tentative confidence of one learning to navigate a world vast and unpredictable, chased after butterflies that danced lazily among the tall grasses, her laughter ringing clear and bright as she stumbled over roots and stones, her small hands reaching out to grasp at sunlight and shadow alike, embodying the unspoken promise of new beginnings that stretched before them both like the winding path beyond the orchard gate. A path both unknown and full of possibility, where every step carried with it the weight of memory and the lightness of discovery, and where Isabeau found herself walking not only as a mother, but as a woman slowly reclaiming a future unshaped by the losses that had once seemed insurmountable. The village, though still bearing the scars of its recent trials, pulsed with the tentative stirrings of renewal, as neighbors mended fences and repaired roofs, as children's voices rose in playful chorus once more, and as the market buzzed with the exchange of goods and gossip, carrying with it the steady rhythm of lives rebuilding themselves piece by piece. And while Isabeau remained mostly within the safe bounds of her home and garden, she occasionally ventured to the well or the churchyard, meeting the cautious gazes of those who whispered about the widow with the quiet strength and the child with eyes too knowing for her years, their glances a mixture of suspicion, pity, and something unspoken that hovered between judgment and reluctant respect. And in these fleeting moments, Isabeau felt the weight of being both seen and unseen, both part of the world and set apart from it. Night after night, beneath a sky studded with stars that seemed to pulse with an ancient, steady light, Isabeau would sit beside the dying embers of the fire, her thoughts drifting like smoke toward memories of Benoit, not in anger or regret, but with a gentle acceptance that carried with it a sense of peace neither sought nor forced, a quiet acknowledgement that some connections endure beyond presence and absence, beyond time and distance, living on in the soft spaces between moments and in the unseen threads that bind hearts together. And while the letter remained folded carefully away, its words echoed softly in the rhythm of her days, a reminder that love, in its many forms, often exists not in grand gestures or declarations, but in the patient tending of what is fragile and precious, in the quiet act of spinning thread through fingers calloused by care. And so the seasons turned, carrying with them the inevitable passage of time and the steady unfolding of life's small miracles, the first strawberries sweet on the tongue, the hum of bees busy among the flowers, the soft patter of rain against the roof, the gentle weight of a child's head resting against a mother's shoulder. And within these moments, Isabeau found a kind of grace that did not shout or demand but whispered softly, a grace born of endurance, of love woven through the fabric of everyday survival, a testament to the strength found not in the absence of hardship but in the willingness to keep living, to keep loving, and to keep believing in the fragile beauty of what might still come, even when the future remained uncertain and the past stretched long behind her like the shadows that lengthened beneath the fading light. The autumn crept quietly into the village, its arrival marked not by sudden storms or sharp chills, but by the slow shift in light that softened the edges of the world and draped the fields in hues of amber and gold. While within the walls of Isabeau's small home, the air grew rich with the scent of drying herbs and the earthy aroma of harvested root vegetables stored carefully in woven baskets. And though the days grew shorter and the evenings carried a hint of the cold to come, there was a comforting rhythm in the turning of the seasons, a steady beat that pulsed through the chores of gathering wood, repairing worn tools, and preparing the hearth for the long months ahead, tasks that grounded Isabeau in the present, even as her mind wandered through memories of the past and dreams of a future still just beyond reach. Alis, now growing taller and more sure on her feet, explored the orchard with a wide-eyed wonder that seemed to catch the fading light and hold it within her laughter, chasing after falling leaves that danced like fireflies in the crisp air. Her small hands eager to catch the last of the summer's warmth before the frost claimed the earth once more. And as Isabeau watched her daughter move through the changing landscape, she felt a surge of fierce protectiveness mingled with a quiet hope. Hope that despite the harshness of their world and the weight of absence that lingered like a shadow, there remained space for joy and growth, for love both tender and resilient, for life to weave its fragile threads through the tapestry of their days and nights. The village itself, scarred but not broken, buzzed with the preparations for the coming winter. Fires were stoked earlier, woolen cloaks mended and patched, communal meals shared where stories of survival mingled with whispered prayers for those who would not see the spring. And though Isabeau kept mostly to herself, she found moments of connection in the shared glances of neighbors who carried their own burdens with quiet dignity, in the exchange of a basket of eggs for a loaf of bread, in the soft murmur of voices around the well that spoke not just of hardship but of a stubborn refusal to let despair take root. A refusal that echoed within her own heart like a steady drumbeat calling her forward through the darkening days. Nights grew longer and colder, and the small fire in the hearth became a focal point of warmth and light, its flickering glow casting dancing shadows on the rough walls where memories lingered like ghosts. Memories of laughter and loss, of promises made and broken, of love that persisted even in absence, weaving its invisible threads through the fabric of Isabeau's life and the growing life of her daughter, whose presence brought both solace and a reminder of the fragile continuity of existence, a living testament to the power of resilience and the quiet courage it takes to hold space for hope when the world offers little but uncertainty. In the stillness between breaths, in the hush of twilight that settled over the orchard and the village beyond, Isabeau found herself drawing strength not from grand gestures or heroic acts but from the simple, enduring rhythms of daily life, the turning of the spinning wheel, the tending of the fire, the soft murmur of a lullaby hummed low enough to blend with the crackling embers. And in these acts, she discovered a kind of sacredness, a profound beauty in the ordinary that whispered of survival and the slow, steady reclamation of joy, a joy not loud or boastful but quiet and deep-rooted, like the sturdy roots of the trees outside that weathered storms and seasons alike without losing their hold on the earth. And as the first frost edged the window panes with delicate lace, and the world beyond wrapped itself in a silent shroud of white, Isabeau held Alis close, feeling the steady beat of the child's heart against her own, a rhythm that echoed through the long, dark nights and carried with it the unspoken promise that even in the coldest, darkest seasons, life endures, love persists, and hope, however fragile, remains a light to guide the way forward. The winter settled over the village like a thick, silent blanket, muffling the sounds of life beneath its cold embrace, while inside the humble cottage, the fire crackled faintly against the gathering shadows, casting a trembling light that danced across the rough walls adorned with dried herbs and the few treasured possessions Isabeau had managed to hold onto through the seasons of loss and renewal. And though the bitter cold pressed against the windows, seeking entry like a relentless visitor, within these walls warmth blossomed in the gentle rhythm of care, the soft hum of a lullaby, the careful wrapping of Alis in layers of wool, the slow turning of the spinning wheel whose steady song wove threads of comfort into the long nights. And in this quiet sanctuary, life moved forward with a fragile grace that defied the harshness beyond the door. Alis, nestled against her mother's side, grew stronger despite the weight of winter's chill, her small fingers curling around the folds of fabric and her bright eyes reflecting the flicker of firelight as she listened to the stories Isabeau whispered. Stories not of knights or kings but of simple acts of courage and love, of seeds planted in the darkest soil and roots that refused to let go. Tales woven not with grandiose words but with the soft strength of memory and hope. And in these moments, Isabeau found a quiet joy that eased the ache of absence and anchored her to the enduring pulse of life beating steadily beneath the fragile surface of their days. Outside, the village lay draped in white, its streets silent save for the occasional crunch of footsteps in the snow, a reminder of the world's persistence even when it seemed paused beneath winter's heavy hand. And though neighbors rarely ventured far beyond their own hearths, there was a shared understanding in the exchanged nods and brief smiles that spoke of communal endurance, of the unspoken bonds forged through hardship and the quiet determination to survive another season, and Isabeau, wrapped in the solitude of her thoughts and the warmth of her child, felt both the weight of isolation and the faint stirrings of connection, a paradox that mirrored the shifting light outside as dawn broke slowly over the frost-covered fields. The letter, still folded and tucked away in its secret place, carried with it a silent echo that resonated through Isabeau's days, a reminder that some stories remain unfinished not because they lack ending but because they live beyond words and time, existing instead in the spaces between moments, in the breath held before speaking, in the lingering glance toward a horizon that shifts with each turning season. And while she neither opened nor spoke of it, the letter shaped the contours of her hope, a quiet beacon in the dim landscape of loss and renewal. As the nights deepened and the cold tightened its grip, Isabeau found solace in the small rituals that threaded through her days, the steady care of tending the fire, the measured cadence of spinning thread, the soft murmur of prayers offered not in grand temples but in the intimate space of a mother's embrace, and in these acts, she wove a tapestry of resilience that shielded her from despair and nurtured the fragile shoots of hope growing quietly within, shoots that promised, even in the harshest seasons, that life endures, that love persists, and that the human spirit, though tested and worn, remains unbroken. The gray dawn seeped slowly through the frost-edged window panes, painting the worn wooden floor with a pale, trembling light that seemed to hold the quiet promise of a new day despite the chill lingering in the air, while Isabeau sat by the hearth, her hands resting lightly on Alice's small shoulders as the child stirred awake, her eyes blinking open to the muted world beyond the glass, where the orchard stood bare and silent beneath a blanket of fresh snow, the branches etched sharp against the pale sky like delicate ink drawings, and though the cold pressed in on every side, inside the cottage a fragile warmth pulsed, a warmth born not of fire alone but of the steady heartbeat of love and endurance that had carried them through long nights and uncertain days, weaving an invisible thread between past and future, absence and presence, despair and hope. The routine of their mornings, simple and unhurried, unfolded with a gentle rhythm. The quiet clatter of water poured into a basin, the soft rustle of linen as Alice was dressed in layers of wool and linen to shield her from the biting air, the careful preparation of porridge simmering slowly over the embers, its faint sweetness filling the small kitchen with comfort. And as Isabeau moved through these tasks, her thoughts wandered not to the hardships that awaited beyond their door, but to the delicate moments of connection and tenderness that softened the edges of their lives, moments that whispered of resilience and grace, of a love that could hold its ground even when the world seemed determined to unravel. Outside, the village lay hushed beneath its snowy mantle, footprints marking the paths of those few who braved the cold to fetch wood or tend to animals, their breath rising in misty clouds that mingled with the crisp air, and though the silence was deep, it was not empty. It carried with it the weight of shared survival, the unspoken knowledge that each day endured was a victory against the relentless passage of winter, a testament to the quiet strength that bound the community even when distance and sorrow threatened to pull them apart. And in this stillness, Isabeau found a reflection of her own journey. A journey marked not by grand triumphs but by the patient tending of small fires, by the careful weaving of life from threads both fragile and unyielding. The letter, folded and tucked away in its hidden place, remained a sacred relic of a past neither fully relinquished nor held too tightly, its presence a subtle anchor in the shifting currents of memory and longing. And though she never unfolded its fragile parchment, its words lived on in the silent spaces between her thoughts, in the quiet hopes she nurtured beneath the weight of solitude, a reminder that some connections transcend absence, living instead in the heart's quiet places where time and loss hold no sway. As evening fell and the fire's glow flickered against the darkening walls, Isabeau cradled Alice close, their breaths mingling in the hush of the room, and in that tender stillness, she allowed herself to dream not of what had been lost but of what might yet be. A life shaped by love's enduring light, by the steadfast courage to face each day anew, by the unspoken promise that even in the coldest, darkest seasons, the human spirit holds within it a spark that refuses to be extinguished, a spark that kindles hope and kindles life itself. The soft glow of candlelight flickered against the rough-hewn walls, casting gentle shadows that swayed like memories in the quiet room where Isabeau sat by the hearth, her fingers idly tracing the worn wood of the spinning wheel while Alice, wrapped snugly in layers of wool, rested peacefully in her arms, their breaths mingling in the stillness that filled the space like a sacred hush. And outside, the biting wind whispered through the bare branches of the orchard, carrying with it the distant echoes of a world both harsh and beautiful, a world that demanded endurance and tenderness in equal measure, where love took root not in grand gestures but in the small, unspoken acts that wove the fabric of survival and hope. As the night deepened and stars glittered faintly through frost-kissed windows, Isabeau's thoughts drifted to the letter she kept hidden, folded carefully away like a fragile secret, its words a silent current beneath the surface of her days, reminding her that even in the absence of certainty, there remained threads of connection that bound her to a past both tender and painful, and though she dared not open it, the letter lived in the spaces between her heartbeats, a quiet testament to the endurance of love beyond time and distance, a whisper of possibility carried on the fragile wings of hope. Alice, even in sleep, seemed to carry the promise of renewal, her small hands curling and uncurling against her mother's chest, a living thread woven into the tapestry of their shared existence, fragile yet unbreakable. And as Isabeau watched her daughter's peaceful face illuminated by the firelight, she felt a fierce tenderness bloom within her, a determination to protect this fragile life, to nurture it against the harshness of the world, to hold it safe in the shelter of her arms and the warmth of her heart, a promise made not in words but in every breath and every quiet touch that passed between them in the stillness of night. And so, beneath the canopy of a cold, silent sky, with the world outside wrapped in winter's hush, Isabeau found herself wrapped not only in wool and firelight but in the enduring strength of love that defies loss, the quiet courage that carries one through the darkest seasons, and the fragile hope that blooms in the hidden places of the heart. A hope that sustains her as she spins thread through the long, cold nights, weaving a future as delicate and determined as the first buds of spring, waiting patiently beneath the snow. The pale light of dawn crept softly through the frost-etched window panes, painting the humble cottage in gentle hues of silver and blue, while inside, Isabeau stirred quietly, her breath steady as she watched Alice sleep, the child's small chest rising and falling beneath layers of warm wool, a fragile pulse of life against the cold, unyielding world beyond the door. And though the winter's grip was still strong, the promise of spring lingered in the lengthening days and the slow, imperceptible thaw that crept through the frozen earth, a reminder that even in the harshest seasons, life holds within it the spark of renewal and the unspoken promise of love's enduring power. Outside, the village remained wrapped in silence, the snow blanketing fields and rooftops in a thick, muffling embrace that softened the edges of the world and pressed the villagers closer to their hearths and each other, where stories were shared in low voices and laughter blossomed briefly amidst the hardships, a testament to the resilience that had carried them through years of loss and uncertainty. And though Isabeau rarely ventured beyond the narrow paths leading to the well or the small chapel at the village's heart, she felt herself bound to this quiet community by threads of shared experience and mutual care, a fragile network of support that offered shelter from the cold and the shadows that lingered in the corners of memory. In the small hours before dawn, when the world was wrapped in deepest stillness and the flicker of candlelight cast soft patterns on the walls, Isabeau often found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here, the love that had blossomed amid the hardships of a world marked by hardship and strife, the loss that had carved deep valleys in her heart, and the fierce hope that still burned quietly within her, a steady flame kindled by the presence of her daughter and the whispered dreams of what might yet be, a hope that refused to be extinguished by the cold or the silence, persisting instead in the slow, patient weaving of life's fragile tapestry. The letter, kept folded and hidden away like a precious relic, remained a silent companion in these moments, its words a faint echo beneath the surface of her consciousness, a reminder that love's reach extends beyond absence and time, living on in the spaces between words and the quiet acts of care that sustain the heart. And though she had not the courage to unfold its fragile parchment and read its promises aloud, the letter shaped the contours of her days and the soft rhythms of her nights, a beacon of possibility in a world too often shadowed by loss and uncertainty. As the first faint light of morning seeped into the room, warming the chill air with its tentative glow, Isabeau gently stirred Alice awake, her soft voice a soothing melody that blended with the distant call of birds heralding the coming day. And in that small moment, suspended between night and day, past and future, mother and child, she found a kind of peace. Not one born of certainty or ease, but a quiet acceptance of life's ebb and flow, its light and shadow, and the enduring power of love to weave meaning into even the most fragile of beginnings. The turning of the seasons, relentless and inevitable, carried Isabeau and Alice through years marked by quiet endurance, whispered hopes, and the steady unfolding of a life rebuilt not on the ruins of what was lost but on the fragile, luminous threads of what remained and what might yet be. And as the sun dipped low behind the distant hills, casting long shadows that stretched like memories across the fields, Isabeau stood at the edge of the orchard, feeling the cool breeze tug gently at her cloak and carrying with it the scent of earth and growing things, a reminder that even after the harshest winters, the world holds within it the promise of renewal and the unyielding pulse of life. Her gaze settled on Alice, now a young girl moving with the assured steps of one who has known both hardship and love, her laughter weaving through the air like sunlight caught in the branches. And in that moment, Isabeau felt the full weight and wonder of the journey. The sorrow that had carved deep spaces within her heart, the fierce love that had filled those spaces with light, the quiet strength found in small acts of care and courage, and the enduring hope that carried her forward through every shadow and storm, a hope that, like the orchard itself, blossomed in time, patiently and without fanfare, its beauty unfolding in the gentle cadence of everyday life. The letter, long since read and folded away, remained less a relic of the past than a symbol of the invisible bonds that stretch across time and distance, reminding her that love's reach is vast and mysterious, capable of sustaining even when unseen, a force that lives on in the silent spaces between heartbeats and the steady rhythm of a mother's care. And as night settled softly over the village, wrapping the world in a quiet embrace, Isabeau felt a profound sense of peace, not in forgetting what had been lost, but in embracing all that had been found, in the delicate balance between memory and presence, grief and hope, absence and love. And so, beneath a sky thick with stars that shimmered like ancient promises, mother and daughter returned to the warmth of their home, the soft glow of the hearth welcoming them back into its fold, a light that flickered steady and sure despite the darkness beyond, a testament to the quiet power of survival, the enduring grace of love, and the unspoken truth that even in the most ordinary moments lies a profound beauty, a deep meaning, and a hope that, no matter how shadowed the path, life continues, fragile, fierce, and forever unfolding.